Hi, my name is Drew Moore, and today I've got Brian Basting and Michael Reginelli joining me in studio. Currently, corn is down 1 penny, soybeans down 16 cents, and wheat down 3 cents, all in the nearby, all post USDA June report. So today, guys, we're going to discuss a multitude of different things, but if there are any questions that anybody does have, please throw them in our YouTube chat function, and we'll try our best to get those answers. But let's start off with corn today. And Brian, question for you: how worried should we be with the corn yield right now, as planting is still being conducted in the northern Midwest?
Anytime you talk about late planting here in mid-June, Drew, we have to push back the pollination dates. And we push back those pollination dates to the hottest period of the summer. In this case, we're going to push back those early pollination dates, for example, in the northern plains, probably into to early August. And anytime you start talking about early August, you be concerned about hot temperatures. So it's varied across the Midwest, Drew, at the moment. We've really got a later start, needless to say, up in North Dakota, parts of Minnesota, later than desired at this time of year. Heart of the Corn Belt probably in some decent shape to good shape at the moment. And moving further east, it's a bit variable. Maybe a few places a bit too wet in the eastern Corn Belt. So it's really a mixed bag, I would say. How worried would we be? Probably not more than usual, Drew, other than, as you said, the late planting up in the northern plains is going to push back that pollination date if we assume normal weather from here on out.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. Michael, question for you. Do you believe we'll see an increase in corn demand for ethanol as we continue to look at gasoline, conventional gasoline versus E85, and certainly that plays a big impact with prices at the pump currently?
Sure. Yeah. I think in general the answer is yes. Although if you're watching kind of the scattered blends, from E15 to E30 to E85, it seems like the spreads in those blends is getting a little bit tighter. But regardless, I don't think it's going to do anything to disrupt higher prices. What it might do maybe is curb a little bit of what could have been really solid summer demand for driving and for gasoline.
Sure.
Might set it back a little bit, but it's not going to do anything, I think, to stave off inevitably higher fuel prices to come. So the one thing I guess I would say though is that ethanol margins are awfully good. I think if you look at July board crush, it's as high as it's been since probably 2014. And if you look at the cash crush, logistics are obviously a challenge across space right now, but the cash crush is like 82%. It's like an 82nd percentile of 2009, which is outstanding. So we do have strong demand from a corn for ethanol standpoint too.
Thank you. Brian, question for you. Give us a rundown on the world wheat situation, right? We're over 100 days into the Russia and Ukraine war. Were there any standouts in the wheat complex from the June report today?
We'll start out, Drew, looking at that Black Sea situation today. What the USDA did with Ukraine today was leave everything unchanged in terms of production and exports for this 22-23 crop year that we just started. The big change today was that they increased Russia wheat production by 1 million tons, and they also increased Russian exports by 1 million tons. Now, that would be a record export program, Drew, from Russia of 40 million tons if realized. Mm-hmm. Now, will that be enough to offset the projected drop of about 47% in Ukraine exports from a year ago? That's up to the market to decide. But that's the Black Sea highlights from today. There are some other highlights worth mentioning, however. In India, that late season heat wave did take a toll on the crop. USDA did lower the crop size today in India by 2 million tons, and they reduced the exports from India by 2 million tons from what they were in May. So there are some that believe that both those numbers, however, are still too conservative, that we could see further reductions in crop size and further reductions in exports in the months ahead. We'll just have to see how that shakes out. So what that does is remove a potential competitor, if you will, from the world market, or a potential country that could offset, if you will, that reduction in Ukraine. We're waiting to see now in the wheat market, Drew, if we're going to see any weather issues in Europe. USDA did reduce the European crop, but only 500,000 tons today, so not much there. We'll have to wait until that July and August report to really get a good handle on that. Wrapping things up with the U.S. market, what we're looking at today, Drew, is a slightly larger winter wheat crop today. Really looking at a steep recovery in white wheat production this year in the Pacific Northwest. We're looking at a sharply lower hard red winter crop, unfortunately, in the central and southern plains. That drought has really taken a toll, particularly on that Texas crop, Oklahoma crop, but that was expected by the market. And the soft red crop looks like it's going to be a good crop, maybe yields down just a touch from last year. So no big surprises in the U.S. balance sheet at this time, Drew.
Thank you, Brian. Michael, question for you on just the structure of the cash markets and spreads. July forward spreads and corn and soybeans have been on the move. I'll say that this past week, and we've got first notice day and the June stocks report coming up here at the end of the month. What's your thoughts on those, and how do they progress moving forward?
Yeah, I think most people realize basis has increased fairly substantially for corn and beans, really from across space, east to west, north to south. We've seen cash values rising in both commodities fairly aggressively, and there's a number of reasons for it. I mentioned ethanol margins are good. Soy processor margins are good as well. July board crush has broke some, but it's very, very strong kind of for the duration. Also, it just feels like availability is getting tight. We did see, obviously, the corn ending stocks grow a little bit today. They lobbed off exports. Exports have been dragging a bit. Bean exports have been very good. We saw carryouts tighten on beans. That's going to roll forward as the carry-in is tighter. It's going to impact, the new crop balance sheet as that bean carryout continues to tighten up. So basis is strong. It also feels like a lot of warehouses have seen strong values. They've had the ability to make sales at profitable levels. They've moved inventory. There just doesn't feel like there's a big, heavy, long basis ownership out there in the warehouse side. And the farmers are kind of getting closer to 100% sold. We did move a little bit of grain this week, but as the farmer is kind of getting down to being fully marketed, the market's feeling some of that tension. So it feels like cash values are continuing to rise. That tends to support spreads or spread inverses until we get to a point where demand gets satisfied. And so that's likely what's going to continue this month until we see some of the end user cash values begin to drop off, signaling that the market's finally comfortably covered. So, and I guess logistics would be the other thing, Drew, too. Actually, rail, sure, truck, even barge, getting moving grain properly is compounding the issue.
Very good, very good. We've got a question from our YouTube page. It's too hot, it's too cold, it's too rainy, there's too little rain. All of these factors. How will this all play out? And it looks like what are the guesses for the yield, which coincides pretty well with the question I was going to ask you, Brian. What's the forecast look like, and what's the trade expecting, as we move forward yield-wise?
It's a great question, Drew. Anytime we move into mid-June, the first day of summer is now 10 days away. We kick off in seriousness the world and the U.S. weather market. Anytime you talk about the next 60 days in corn especially, you're talking about critical time period. Corn is so sensitive to the market, to the weather, during pollination. At the moment, we're looking at a very hot and very dry weather pattern, Drew, over the next 2 weeks. Some record temperatures may be approached next week, we understand. Short term, I guess I wouldn't think that would harm the crop too much. Anytime you get some warm, dry weather in June, maybe some of those roots for the corn crop will dig down or search for water, as you move into the accelerated growth period. The key, Drew, I would say, is if the dryness were to persist past 2 weeks, corn water needs accelerate rapidly moving into that last week in June, and especially those first 2 weeks in July. Corn water needs ramp up exponentially. It needs rain. So no matter how deep those roots go, but over the short term, I think hot, dry weather, it's not the very best for the crop, but it isn't detrimental. The viewer's question is a good one. It's too hot, it's too cold, it's too wet, it's too dry. I would just recommend, or in my opinion, from a risk management standpoint, from a strategy standpoint, have your strategy constructed prior to the increased market volatility, because it's extremely difficult to make a marketing plan, adjust a marketing plan, Drew, on the go with a weather market in place. So really encourage your viewers to work closely with their advisor and get their plan in place so it becomes systematic and calm. That is, the reaction to market volatility is systematic and calm when it occurs, and it sure is high likelihood that it will occur given the tight stocks that Michael just described.
So on top of that too, I'll just piggyback it for a minute, because the too hot, too wet, too cold, all of those things, one of the answers might be it's too early, as Brian noted. It's early in the year, and so there's a lot that can happen. The one thing that we do know is that the USDA made the unique move in May of reducing the yield, which traditionally does not happen that early in the season. So we're negotiating not necessarily from a point of leverage at this point. Them moving the yield from 181 to 177 is a tough go here as we kind of move forward. It's going to be much more difficult to actually increase that than it's going to be to decrease it as we work through those weather events. And then the next question is going to be acreage at the end of the month. Private analysts out there anywhere from 89 million to 91.5 million. That's going to matter on where we land from a corn acreage standpoint. How much preventative plan is out there? How much did the delayed planting actually force a shift from corn to beans? There's a lot of unanswered questions in addition to the weather that we're going to have to watch here. So it sets the stage for volatility, kind of towards Brian's last point.
Absolutely. It's an extremely dynamic market right now. There's another question, and Michael, I'll direct this to you since you talked about cash markets and the spread structure, but a question of when do corn and soybeans go back to, either an even market or not having an inverse, right? I mean, that's, looking at carryouts of where they're at right now. A little bit of a loaded question, but it may be a bit, yeah?
It feels like it could be. It's a lot of it's going to depend on the crop size in the U.S. A lot of it's going to depend on what happens in the Black Sea. What not only is their production going to be like, but are those supplies going to be available to the world market for the next crop cycle? Grains are so different than energies in that way. We can't extract production on a daily basis, right? Based on the ebbs and flows of supply and demand. We, with the exception of the safrinha crop in Brazil and maybe a few other minimal exceptions, we kind of have one shot to produce a crop, and then we got to stretch that inventory through the balance of the year. So if we have a disruption or we miss that cycle, things tend to stay tight for longer windows than they do in other commodities when we talk about ags specifically. So regardless of what happened today, even with the new crop corn carryout growing a little bit, it's still relatively tight from a historic perspective. Beans are very, very tight based on today's numbers, and depending on who you talk to, they could get a lot tighter as we kind of work our way into the fall. So it doesn't build scenarios for big carry markets. That's not to say that we can't see that develop in the next year. Certainly with new crop spreads, we're going to own a lot of inventory at the elevator level and the end user level this fall, and that tends to help satisfy demand. If we have big ownership books because farmers rewarded the market, sold high prices like they should, then we might have enough demand to supply to comfortably cover demand for Ocno, Dees, and beyond, and maybe get a little carry there. But beyond that, there's so many variables that'll dictate whether we can see extractable carry markets as we work our way into 2023.
Right. That makes sense. Last quick question, from my end. This morning, the CPI is at 8.6, right? So inflation rose to 8.6 in May, highest since 1981. What are the broad-based impacts on commodities in general? And if you want to get specific to ags as well, that's fine as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with all kinds of issues. I mean, we got a tight labor market. GDP growth is expected to slow the balance of this year in basically every country, except for or the Middle East, North Africa, because there's thoughts that energy exports will actually maybe help support those economies. But in general, certainly in emerging Europe and North America and even the Pacific Rim, like we're gonna have slower GDP growth. So there's going to be challenges. The war is going to continue to aggravate supply shortages. It's going to cause additional inflationary pressure. There's almost no way around it. But because of the war, the tendency or the kind of line of logic has been, we're going to buy commodities and sell equities, and that's kind of what's been happening. Although we are starting to see it maybe turn a little bit. If you look at like the net managed money position in grains, it's off $15 to $20 billion from the mid-April record high that we saw, historically it's still extremely high. You know, the ownership is massive, but it has fallen considerably. So we are seeing a little bit of risk off there. I think FAO put the food price index fell for like the second month, but it's still 22 or 23% higher than where it was a year ago. So we're certainly not out of the woods. It feels like balance of 2023 or 2022 we're going to kind of be in this.
Perfect. All right. Thank you guys both for your time today. Very much appreciated. And please tune in next time on the June 30th USDA stocks and acreage reporting. Thanks.
Cool.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.